Stop what you're doing and listen to me. What if I told you that the most devastating weapon the United States military deployed in Vietnam wasn't napalm, and it wasn't the B-52 bomber? It was 6 men who vanished into the deepest, darkest jungles, didn't speak a single word for 6 whole days, and completely wiped out an entire enemy headquarters. The Pentagon has kept the full truth of this buried for decades. Why? Because the official history books want you to believe conventional troops fought that war. They don't want to talk about the ghost units. They don't want to admit that while the regular army was stumbling through the jungle like a herd of elephants, a classified brotherhood of elite operators was quietly racking up an impossible, sickeningly high kill ratio of 50-1. We are talking about men so utterly lethal, so terrifyingly invisible, that the enemy high command literally referred to them as demons who disappear into the forest and return with fire. But what really happened during those 6 days of dead silence? How does a tiny, isolated team of Americans deliberately trap themselves just 30 meters away from a massive, heavily armed enemy column and survive? Today we are tearing open the classified archives. I am going to reveal the shocking insider truth about a Black Ops mission that officially never existed. I'm going to show you the psychological torture, the institutional sorcery, and the brutal reality of how the true gods of the jungle operated when nobody was watching. If you think you know the Vietnam War, you are dead wrong. Do not click away. Stick with me until the very end of this video, because I am going to break down the exact mind-blowing trap they set and the terrifying 8-second radio call that unleashed pure, unadulterated hell on Earth. You won't find this in any textbook. Buckle up, hit that subscribe button, and let's step into the shadows. You need to erase absolutely everything you think you know about the secret operations conducted deep within the unforgiving jungles of Southeast Asia, because the most terrifying reality was never broadcast on the evening television news. This is not some fabricated Hollywood dramatization designed to sell movie tickets, nor is it a comforting metaphor crafted to make civilians feel safe in their homes. This is the raw, unflinching, and heavily classified truth about how long-range reconnaissance patrol operations actually functioned when nobody was watching from Washington. Imagine the sheer psychological terror of being part of a microscopic element, consisting of merely 4 to 6 individuals deliberately inserted into hostile territories, completely controlled by an overwhelming opposing force. These phantom operators were dropped directly into the absolute nightmare of the Central Highlands, the treacherous border regions, and the impossibly dense river deltas without any safety net whatsoever. There was absolutely no immediate fire support waiting to rain down protective steel upon their panicked request, and there was certainly no heavily armed quick reaction force sitting on a runway waiting to rescue them from a catastrophic situation. These isolated men were given absolutely no guarantee of extraction if their cover was blown, meaning they essentially accepted a deliberate one-way ticket into the darkest abyss imaginable. Their sole, uncompromising mission was to become completely invisible to the naked eye, to blend flawlessly into the shadows of the ancient canopy, and to become unspeakably lethal only when the absolute perfect moment presented itself. The level of mental endurance required to willingly step off a hovering helicopter skid into the pitch-black unknown, knowing that thousands of armed adversaries surround you, is something conventional military doctrine simply cannot comprehend. These extraordinary individuals operated entirely outside the boundaries of standard military logic, transforming themselves into silent predators who hunted high-value targets without leaving a single trace of their presence. But this chilling realization regarding their total isolation was merely the first layer of an incredibly massive military cover-up that would change the course of covert warfare forever. Before we can truly comprehend the astonishing magnitude of what these silent professionals accomplished, we must absolutely expose the embarrassing failures of the conventional military machine that operated in the exact same environment. By all traditional standards of warfare, the United States Armed Forces deployed the absolute most powerful, technologically advanced, and overwhelmingly destructive ground force ever assembled in a tropical environment. The top military brass possessed an unlimited budget that provided them with massive fleets of helicopters in numbers that no other nation had ever dared to field in combat. They controlled sprawling artillery networks that possessed the frightening capability to drop devastating high-explosive steel onto a precise target within exactly 90 seconds of a desperate radio call. They commanded the skies with screaming close air support, horrific napalm drops, and those legendary B-52 bomber strikes that could instantly transform an entire square kilometer of breathing vegetation into a smoking, completely unrecognizable crater field. The wealthy generals lounging in their secure headquarters possessed all of this unimaginable, apocalyptic firepower at their absolute fingertips, yet they were suffering a humiliating, catastrophic defeat in the crucial war of intelligence. The regular infantry battalions moved through the dense vegetation in massive, clumsy formations that essentially announced their exact location to every single farmer, every hidden scout, and every vigilant trail watcher within a 500-meter radius. You must picture the absurd spectacle of a massive, company-sized element forcefully pushing its way through unforgiving vines and thick foliage. The humiliating sound of an entire company pushing through the brush, the deafening crunch of breaking branches, the loud clinking of metal canteens, the undisciplined radio chatter, and the constant coughing of exhausted infantrymen was perfectly audible to any trained ear from extraordinary distances. The enemy forces did not even have to fight these loud, predictable columns of traditional soldiers. They merely watched them stumble blindly into the traps. Yet this monumental failure of conventional tactics was just a precursor to an even more shocking tactical revolution that the Pentagon desperately tried to keep out of the history books. The heavily armed opposing forces simply stepped off the main paths, melted into the surrounding shadows, let the noisy Americans pass by undisturbed, and casually resumed their covert operations the exact moment the conventional column marched out of sight. This humiliating cat-and-mouse game resulted in billions of taxpayer dollars being wasted on massive search operations that yielded absolutely nothing but frustrated commanders and exhausted, demoralized troops. The regular military machine was entirely blind in an environment where vision and stealth were the only true currencies of survival. The top-ranking officials finally realized that sending a massive, incredibly noisy battalion to locate a deeply hidden adversary was a recipe for absolute tactical disaster. This specific, fundamental problem of institutional blindness is exactly what gave birth to the highly classified Long-Range Reconnaissance Patrol program that would soon terrify the enemy high command. If the most powerful army in the world could not successfully locate the hidden adversary with a massive battalion of heavily armed men, perhaps they could track him down with just 6 extraordinary individuals who moved exactly like ghosts. The concept of small unit reconnaissance deep behind hostile lines was certainly not a brand new invention, as shadow operations are essentially as old as warfare itself. However, within the dense, suffocating canopy of this specific conflict, this ancient concept was heavily refined and perfected into something that bordered on absolute institutional sorcery. The remarkable operators who deployed across these dangerous territories between the years of 1965 and 1972 were not simply standard military scouts looking for footprints in the mud. They were an unimaginably precise intelligence-gathering instrument and a devastating strike coordination tool completely capable of watching a massive opposing force for several days without ever being detected. But the sheer magnitude of their destructive capability was about to unleash a level of devastation that would leave conventional generals entirely speechless. After silently observing their prey for days on end, these microscopic teams could flawlessly drop that massive enemy force into a catastrophically prepared elimination zone exactly at a moment of American choosing. The heavily guarded numbers and statistics standing behind this highly classified program are absolutely staggering, and they have never received the massive public attention or the glorious front-page headlines they so rightfully deserve. American long-range patrol units quietly conducted approximately 23,000 separate patrol operations over the violent course of the entire extended conflict. Two-thirds of those incredibly dangerous patrols, which translates to roughly 15,000 deeply classified missions, made direct, terrifying contact with hostile forces operating in the area. This was not a program of mere observation. This was a highly calculated campaign of psychological and physical domination executed by men who thrived in the most hostile conditions imaginable. The confirmed elimination ratios claimed by these shadow units reached incredibly shocking heights, peaking at an astonishing 50-1 during certain highly active operational periods. You must completely process the gravity of that specific number. 50 hostile combatants permanently neutralized for every single American operator who met a tragic end in the treacherous jungle. The total number of enemy losses directly attributed to these precise, team-directed tactical strikes and brutal direct engagements is officially estimated at around 10,000 confirmed liquidations. For a covert force that never exceeded a few thousand active operators at any given point in the timeline, those astonishing numbers represent an unparalleled efficiency of violence. It is an overwhelming level of tactical perfection that conventional warfare, with all its massive tanks and roaring jets, simply cannot ever hope to match or replicate. However, these jaw-dropping statistics only scratch the surface of a much deeper, far more terrifying psychological warfare campaign that we are just beginning to uncover. The sheer fact that merely 4 to 6 isolated men could consistently outmaneuver, outsmart, and ultimately obliterate formations that were 50 times their own size completely shatters the traditional understanding of how ground combat is supposed to function. Conventional commanders, who were heavily obsessed with capturing useless hills and counting bodies, frequently found themselves deeply unsettled by the unprecedented success of these silent, unconventional warriors. The established military hierarchy simply could not fully comprehend how a tiny handful of exhausted men carrying minimal rations and communicating through mere hand signals could single-handedly dismantle massive logistics corridors. The operators achieved this unparalleled success precisely because they completely abandoned the loud, aggressive, and incredibly clumsy methods that defined the regular infantry battalions. They stripped away all the unnecessary heavy equipment, discarded the restrictive operational manuals, and embraced a level of primal stealth that terrified even the most hardened hostile commanders operating in the region. Every single mission was a highly calculated gamble with their own existence, relying entirely on their razor-sharp senses, their absolute physical discipline, and their unshakable trust in the man crawling through the mud right next to them. The opposing forces quickly learned to fear these tiny teams far more than the roaring jet fighters, because a bomber only strikes once, but a silent operator could bring a devastating artillery barrage down upon your hidden camp while you were sleeping. The incredible ratio of 50 neutralized targets to one tragic loss stands as a permanent, undeniable testament to the absolute supremacy of specialized training over sheer, uncoordinated numerical advantage. These numbers prove beyond any shadow of a doubt that the most dangerous weapon on the battlefield is not the explosive device itself, but the incredibly patient, unseen mind that decides exactly when and where that explosive device will detonate. This unprecedented efficiency of violence remains one of the most heavily guarded, sensational secrets of the entire conflict, carefully hidden away in classified archives to protect the fragile egos of the conventional military establishment. But the unbelievable reality of how these phantom operators actually achieved this impossible dominance in the field will leave you absolutely paralyzed with shock. The brutal reality of their operational environment required a level of psychological endurance that would easily break the minds of 99% of the general population. When you are operating as a team of just 6 men, entirely surrounded by a hostile army, every single snapped twig, every deep breath, and every quiet whisper carries the potential for immediate, catastrophic consequences. The operators had to fully reprogram their basic human instincts, essentially teaching themselves to suppress the natural urge to run or fight when faced with overwhelming danger. Instead of panicking, they utilized a terrifying level of patience, transforming their bodies into motionless statues while heavily armed patrols walked mere inches away from their hidden positions. This incredible discipline allowed them to gather the crucial intelligence that the regular army desperately needed but completely failed to obtain through their incredibly loud, destructive search methods. By the time the regular army finally realized the absolute necessity of these ghost units, the operators had already perfected their dark craft and were actively dismantling the enemy infrastructure from the inside out. They became the ultimate nightmare for the opposing logisticians, turning the supposedly safe supply routes into terrifying gauntlets of sudden, inescapable destruction. The unbelievable 50-to-1 elimination ratio was not achieved through random luck or chaotic firefights. It was the direct result of cold, calculated, and perfectly executed ambushes directed entirely from the shadows. The sheer amount of tactical damage inflicted by these few thousand individuals completely rewrote the rulebook of special operations, setting a golden standard of absolute lethality that modern elite units still relentlessly strive to achieve today. Their legendary exploits demonstrate exactly why the government prefers to keep the true details of these shadow operations locked away behind heavily redacted documents and classified vault doors. Forget everything you have ever seen in glossy action movies about glorious soldiers parachuting safely into clear, well-lit drop zones with overwhelming aerial support covering their descent. The terrifying reality of deep infiltration behind heavily fortified hostile lines always began with a heart-stopping leap into absolute, paralyzing darkness, where one tiny mistake meant an immediate fatal outcome for the entire team. The insertion phase was universally recognized by elite operators as the most incredibly dangerous moment of the entire covert mission, where the terrifying threat of ultimate tragedy loomed over them long before their boots even touched the soil. Transport helicopters absolutely never touched the ground during these highly classified drops, because the deafening mechanical roar of an engine landing would instantly compromise the operation before it even truly began. Pilots deliberately kept their hovering aircraft in constant forward motion, forcing heavily burdened operators to step directly off the narrow skids into the violent swirling downdraft of the massive rotor blades. These phantom warriors plummeted blindly into towering, razor-sharp elephant grass or slammed brutally onto incredibly steep tropical slopes entirely covered in slippery, rotting tropical vegetation. A man often had to desperately grab a thick, thorny root with his bare, bleeding hands just to stop his exhausted body from uncontrollably sliding directly into a hostile patrol camp waiting silently below. The designated landing zone was specifically chosen by military intelligence for one brilliant, highly deceptive reason: it was absolutely nowhere near their actual high-value target or their intended long-term observation post. Commanders routinely inserted these isolated teams 1, 2, or even 3 kilometers away from the intended operational area to deliberately confuse any tracking units patrolling the immediate vicinity. This brilliant tactical deception was absolutely necessary because the opposing forces were intimately familiar with their own terrain and would instantly swarm any suspicious aerial activity with overwhelming numbers. But this terrifying plunge into the abyss was merely the opening act of an unparalleled psychological nightmare that would push these men to the absolute brink of human sanity. For the first 3 or 4 hours after hitting the unforgiving ground, these isolated men did absolutely nothing except lie completely motionless in the suffocating insect-infested mud. They allowed the aggressive buzzing of massive tropical insects and the thick 100-degree humid air to completely wash over them while their heightened senses scanned the perimeter for impending doom. If their chaotic airborne insertion had been visually observed by opposition scouts, heavily armed pursuit teams would descend upon those exact coordinates with terrifying, overwhelming speed and extreme prejudice. The continued survival of the entire 6-man unit depended entirely on the surrounding jungle, maintaining its natural, undisturbed acoustic rhythm during those agonizing, sweat-drenched early hours of the deployment. Only when the tropical canopy remained perfectly serene did the team leader offer the slightest visual hand signal that it was finally time to begin their harrowing advance into the deeply unknown territory. However, the fundamental concept of movement for a long-range reconnaissance patrol completely defied every single doctrine ever taught to conventional infantry battalions at the prestigious military academies. The operational speed of these elite teams was never measured in standard kilometers per hour, but rather in agonizing, microscopic meters per hour that demanded absolute physical perfection and iron discipline. The most heavily experienced units routinely covered as little as 200 meters during an entire 24-hour period of continuous, backbreaking physical exertion and extreme mental focus. They were forced to completely halt their forward momentum after taking just 2 or 3 incredibly cautious steps to frantically listen, furiously smell the damp air, and meticulously watch the dense shadows. This excruciatingly slow, deliberate pacing was the only mathematically viable way to navigate a hostile environment that was heavily populated by an adversary who intimately knew every single hidden trail. Yet this agonizingly slow pace hid a sensational, almost supernatural tactical advantage that the Pentagon desperately wanted to keep entirely classified from the general public and the scrutinizing press. The dense, ancient jungle possesses its very own unique acoustic signature when it remains completely undisturbed by the destructive, noisy presence of heavily armed human beings marching through the brush. There is a constant, predictable symphony of calling birds, humming insects, and the distant, soothing sound of rushing water that fills every single cubic inch of the heavy tropical atmosphere. The exact moment that natural signature violently changes, or the terrifying instant that the local birds suddenly go completely silent in one specific quadrant, an operator instantly knows that severe danger is rapidly approaching. They understood with chilling, absolute certainty that something incredibly large and highly aggressive had just forcefully pushed its way through that specific patch of thick vegetation directly ahead of them. This incredible ability to decipher the subtle environmental background noise became their ultimate, foolproof early warning system against sudden, devastating ambushes in the green hell. The most legendary and highly decorated team leaders could effortlessly read those sudden, unnatural silences, the exact same way a master musician flawlessly reads an incredibly complex classical score. They utilized this sensational sensory mastery to identify not just the mere physical presence of opposition forces, but their precise direction of travel, their estimated numerical strength, and their tactical formation. They could rapidly process all of this incredibly critical intelligence without ever laying their naked eyes on a single opposing soldier walking through the heavy, suffocating brush. This unprecedented level of environmental awareness was definitely not a natural human trait, but rather the brutal result of agonizing conditioning at the notorious Recondo School and countless days surviving behind enemy lines. The failure rate at these specialized training facilities was astronomically high, ensuring that only the absolute most resilient individuals ever made it into a live operational theater. But becoming a true apex predator required sacrificing every last shred of their former civilian humanity and abandoning everything they once knew about modern, comfortable civilization. These chosen men had to completely abandon everything fundamentally American about the way they casually walked, loudly talked, and carelessly existed in the civilized world. They actively shed their loud, chaotic cultural habits, systematically transforming themselves from ordinary teenagers from the Midwest into perfectly calibrated instruments of silent observation and tactical execution. Men who somehow managed to survive their first 3 or 4 catastrophic missions into contested territory always returned to the forward operating base, fundamentally altered on an incredibly deep psychological level. They held their exhausted bodies completely differently. They analyzed their surroundings with a chilling, clinical detachment, and they truly started thinking exactly like the merciless jungle itself. It was precisely this deliberate, highly classified psychological transformation that made surviving a devastating 6-day patrol in deeply hostile territory an actual, verifiable, tactical possibility. The specific logistical corridor in question ran directly through a heavily fortified section of terrain that American aviation intelligence had confidently flagged as a probable massive resupply artery. High-altitude photo reconnaissance missions had clearly shown unnatural compression patterns in the dense upper canopy, which provided undeniable visual evidence of repeated heavy foot traffic directly below the tree line. Furthermore, advanced signals intelligence aircraft had recently intercepted highly suspicious, low-level radio transmissions that were entirely consistent with a major logistical coordination node operating somewhere to the immediate north. The massive bureaucratic problem that deeply frustrated field commanders was that words like probable and possible are completely useless and thoroughly unacceptable in the precise, unforgiving language of heavy artillery. To unleash the ultimate fiery devastation from the skies, the High Command absolutely needed unblinking human eyes staring directly into the terrifying jaws of the beast. You absolutely needed highly trained personnel to physically watch the hidden trail, meticulously count the moving columns, carefully map the hidden approach routes, and expertly identify the fatal choke points. They were tasked with specifically marking the exact mathematical coordinates where an opposing column would become the absolute densest, and therefore the most incredibly vulnerable to sudden, catastrophic, explosive fragmentation. That is exactly what this legendary 6-man team was violently inserted into the dark jungle to accomplish on that fateful autumn morning in 1968. Their classified operation was originally planned for a grueling 4 days, but it was abruptly extended to a full 6 days when the initial intelligence proved to be far richer and much more dangerous than anyone had previously expected. This sudden operational extension meant they would have to stretch their already heavily depleted water reserves and physical endurance far beyond the absolute breaking point. To achieve this impossible level of perfect stealth, the team's physical equipment was ruthlessly stripped down to the absolute bare, uncompromising minimum required to sustain a human heartbeat. There were absolutely no heavy, cumbersome backpacks allowed on the mission, and they carried absolutely no extra luxury rations beyond what could be forcefully compressed into the smallest possible load-bearing vests. Their specialized weaponry was meticulously chosen for absolute silence and terrifying close-range effectiveness, rather than for engaging targets at long, sustained, conventional infantry distances. The highly experienced team leader carried a heavily modified weapon featuring an advanced suppressor, ensuring that any necessary close-quarters elimination would remain nothing more than a quiet, unnoticed whisper in the dark. Every single piece of metallic gear they carried was heavily wrapped in thick, black tape to absolutely prevent even the slightest accidental clinking sound that could instantly betray their hidden position. but their primary method of delivering widespread devastation relied on a technological marvel that still completely strikes unparalleled fear into the hearts of military historians today. Every single man on that patrol carried multiple Claymore mines, which are incredibly brutal, curved, directional fragmentation charges specifically designed to completely obliterate anything standing directly in the operational zone. When these devastating explosive devices are properly positioned and perfectly angled across a narrow jungle trail, they can effortlessly devastate an entire column of men in a single, absolutely deafening detonation. Each individual charge is packed tight with roughly 700 solid steel balls that are violently propelled forward by a massive, half-kilogram block of high-grade explosive compound. They also carefully carried the incredibly heavy, desperately vital long-range radio pack that would eventually be used to call down the heavens and completely erase the enemy from the map. This highly sophisticated radio was their only true lifeline to the outside world, serving as the sole terrifying instrument that could authorize the complete destruction of the entire opposing force. Furthermore, they safeguarded highly classified topological maps and complex cryptographic coding materials that were absolutely essential for the ultimate success of their secret, deeply isolated deployment. These crucial mathematical tools were the absolute key to miraculously turning 6 grueling days of silent, agonizing observation into one single, catastrophic, coordinated strike from the looming clouds above. They were definitely not sent into the dense green hell simply to engage in a reckless, noisy shootout that would undoubtedly result in an immediate and tragic fatal outcome for the 6 isolated Americans. Their profound, overarching purpose was to quietly locate the beating heart of the enemy logistics machine and coordinate an explosive surgical strike that would forever shatter the opposition's capacity to wage war. The sheer amount of destructive power firmly held within the dirty, blistered hands of just 6 utterly silent men represented a monumental shift in how modern covert warfare would be ruthlessly conducted for decades to come. The sheer physical burden of carrying this specialized destructive arsenal through an environment that actively fought against their every movement is almost impossible for a civilian mind to fully comprehend. Each operator had to continuously balance the immense crushing weight of extra radio batteries, dense explosive materials, and hundreds of rounds of heavy ammunition while flawlessly maintaining the delicate balance of a tightrope walker. If a single operator accidentally dropped a heavy steel magazine or inadvertently snagged a hidden tripwire, the resulting noise would echo through the valley like a massive thunderclap, instantly alerting hundreds of heavily armed sentries. Therefore, they practiced moving with their heavy gear until their muscles screamed in sheer agony, repeatedly rehearsing every single tactical maneuver in total darkness until it became pure, unbreakable muscle memory. This obsessive, almost psychotic level of physical and mental preparation was the absolute only reason why they could confidently stalk their human prey while carrying enough concentrated explosive power to level an entire city block. But all of this flawless, exhausting preparation would be aggressively put to the ultimate, terrifying test the absolute second they finally locked eyes with their heavily armed targets. For the first 48 hours of this incredibly perilous deployment, the isolated operators relentlessly scoured the suffocating undergrowth, finding only ghostly, frustrating traces of a massive enemy logistical machine. They meticulously tracked fresh scuff marks on giant tropical roots and carefully analyzed unnaturally pressed vegetation that strongly hinted at a colossal, hidden presence operating right under their noses. The dense, unforgiving jungle played cruel psychological games with their exhausted minds, offering only distant, muffled sounds of heavy movement that mysteriously faded away into the humid air before they could be accurately pinpointed. Then, on the fateful, foggy morning of the 3rd day, the heavily camouflaged lead scout suddenly raised a tightly clenched fist into the air, instantly freezing the entire Phantom patrol strictly in their tracks. Just 30 meters ahead of their concealed position, perfectly framed through a narrow twisting gap in the heavy vines, an unimaginably massive column of the opposing army was casually marching directly south. This was absolutely not a standard small-scale resupply element, as the disconnected military intelligence analysts in Washington had previously and rather foolishly suggested to the command staff. It was a colossal, heavily armed military force that stretched incredibly far beyond their limited visual range, presenting a terrifying threat that could easily erase the small American team in a matter of seconds. But this shocking, blood-chilling revelation was merely the explosive opening scene of a psychological nightmare that would rapidly push human endurance to its absolute, unimaginable breaking point. What exactly happens inside the fragile human mind when 6 completely isolated men suddenly discover they are lying utterly exposed just 30 meters away from a heavily armed, hostile battalion? A normal, conventionally trained infantryman would instantly succumb to blinding, overwhelming panic, accidentally make a fatal noise, recklessly pull the trigger, and inevitably face an immediate, brutal tragedy alongside his entire squad. However, the highly trained long-range reconnaissance patrol operator performs a miraculous, almost supernatural feat of psychological discipline that completely defies basic human biology and fundamental survival instincts. He literally ceases to exist as a detectable physical entity, completely dissolving his human presence, his scent, and his thermal signature into the surrounding mud and rotting tropical leaves. His racing heartbeat artificially slows down to a faint, barely detectable rhythm. His shallow breathing becomes practically non-existent, and he absolutely refuses to turn his exposed neck, choosing instead to meticulously track targets using only the agonizingly slow movement of his eyeballs. The overwhelming, adrenaline-fueled temptation to instantly open fire and eliminate 20 highly vulnerable targets was incredibly high, but shooting prematurely would instantly alert the entire heavily fortified region and end their mission in an ultimate tragedy. They deliberately chose the excruciating path of total paralysis, silently refusing to neutralize a mere fraction of the enemy, when staying perfectly hidden would eventually allow them to completely erase hundreds of hostile combatants. Yet this extraordinary, mind-bending display of physical paralysis was just the terrifying precursor to a much more sensational tactical revelation that would redefine the entire covert war. The frozen operators silently rotated their uncomfortable observation positions in absolute harmony, communicating highly complex tactical data utilizing exclusively fluid hand signals that had flawlessly become their seamless second language. They meticulously counted the endless marching columns, expertly logged the precise time intervals between passing units, and carefully noted the rigid security halts that consistently occurred in the darkest hours around midnight. They brilliantly identified a highly predictable, fatal compression of the marching troops at 2 specific, incredibly narrow geographical choke points where the dense jungle roots physically forced the enemy into tightly packed clusters. However, the brilliant team leader quickly realized that the sheer volume of passing traffic, combined with the intricate network of newly laid communication wires, indicated something vastly more significant than a mere routine supply route. He was actually staring directly at a massive, highly strategic battalion headquarters unit that was brazenly moving into a new commanding position right under the blinded eyes of conventional American intelligence. Sending a standard, lengthy radio transmission to proudly report this massive jackpot was an extreme hazard, as highly capable hostile tracking units could pinpoint any broadcast lasting more than 30 seconds and rain down immediate, explosive retribution upon their heads. Therefore, the commander brilliantly compressed this monumental intelligence into a heavily encrypted 8-second radio burst, successfully transmitting the golden coordinates before instantly plunging his entire team into absolute, terrifying radio silence for the next 36 hours. What happened during those subsequent hours of total, agonizing darkness would forever redefine the absolute limits of human psychological survival and permanently secure their legendary status. Back at the heavily fortified forward operating base, the stunned intelligence officers frantically decoded that incredibly brief, 8-second transmission and immediately initiated a massive, desperate mobilization of aerial and heavy artillery assets. They urgently pre-registered devastating heavy artillery batteries onto the precise coordinates provided by the Shadow team, while simultaneously placing heavily armed tactical aircraft on immediate, high-alert standby. Meanwhile, the 6 isolated operators were completely trapped in a sweltering, unforgiving purgatory, forced to lie absolutely motionless in ambient temperatures that easily and routinely exceeded 35 degrees Celsius during the scorching daylight hours. They were entirely deprived of any normal human necessities, forced to endure 36 grueling hours without a single moment of proper sleep, without consuming warm food, and without utilizing any basic sanitary facilities whatsoever. Ruthless swarms of massive tropical insects relentlessly feasted upon their exposed, painted skin, yet the stoic operators could not risk making a single defensive physical movement or uttering a sound louder than a faint, ghostly whisper. These incredible veterans entered a profound, almost mystical psychological state that they exclusively and quietly referred to as going deep, representing a transcendent level of sensory hypersensitivity where the threatening jungle suddenly felt intimately familiar and strangely welcoming. They reported an unbelievable, almost telepathic capability to physically feel the heavy footsteps of the enemy vibrating through the deep soil, essentially merging their own central nervous systems with the ancient breathing forest around them. However, this grueling sanity testing period of agonizing, silent observation was merely the tightly wound mechanical spring preparing to unleash absolute, unmatched tactical devastation upon the unsuspecting enemy. On the tense, foggy morning of the 6th consecutive day in the hostile wild, the exhausted team leader finally keyed his heavy radio handset once again to securely transmit the ultimate catastrophic target package to the waiting command center. In a breathless, heavily encrypted burst lasting barely 40 seconds, he seamlessly delivered the exact timing windows, the precise column spacing, and the undeniable geographical location of the enemy headquarters element that he had been patiently tracking. With the terrifying tactical trap now fully set in the distant command centers, the Shadow operators faced the incredibly dangerous, heart-stopping task of physically planting their explosive charges right under the noses of the marching adversary. Operating in absolute suffocating darkness and completely deprived of restorative sleep for over 4 agonizing days, the Phantom team silently crawled toward the 2 previously identified narrow choke points along the muddy, well-traveled trail. They meticulously positioned their devastating directional fragmentation charges directly into the packed dirt, carefully and invisibly running the fragile command wires back through the dense undergrowth to their heavily concealed, perfectly protected firing positions. It took 2 agonizing hours of holding their breath to perfectly orchestrate this deadly mechanical web, utilizing the brief, predictable gaps between passing enemy patrols to cross the highly dangerous path completely undetected. Finally, the team leader verified that every single explosive asset was armed and secretly sent one final, completely silent double-click over the radio frequency to definitively signal to the artillery base that the grand finale was fully ready. The subsequent symphony of orchestrated tactical destruction that immediately followed would eternally echo through military history as an absolute masterpiece of calculated tragedy and unmatched precision. The meticulous mechanics of this perfectly coordinated shadow ambush represented one of the most highly sophisticated tactical operations ever executed during the entire sprawling, chaotic conflict in Southeast Asia. At exactly 01:17 in the early morning, the leading element of a massive opposing column, accurately estimated to contain between 140 and 160 heavily armed personnel, blindly stepped directly into the northern choke point. The perfectly concealed Americans could clearly hear the distinctive, rhythmic slapping of rubber sandals on the packed dirt and the quiet, arrogant murmurs of men who foolishly believed they were completely safe in their own heavily guarded territory. Then, at precisely 01:26, as the densely packed column reached its maximum fatal vulnerability right between the two wired choke points, the cold-blooded team leader firmly pressed the heavy mechanical detonator. The simultaneous, thunderous eruption of multiple overlapping explosive charges unleashed a blinding, horrific storm of thousands of steel projectiles that instantly wiped out the entire leading element in a tiny fraction of a single second. Within mere heartbeats of the initial devastating blast, pre-registered heavy artillery shells began raining down from the pitch-black sky, violently sealing off the northern and southern escape routes with an impenetrable, explosive wall of shattered steel. Panicked survivors desperately broke from the bloody trail and fled blindly into the adjacent tree lines, only to be instantly met by circling, heavily armed aircraft that brutally finished the merciless tactical job. In a brutally short, apocalyptic window of just 7 minutes, a colossal logistical headquarters was completely erased from the face of the earth, leaving absolutely nothing behind but smoking craters and utter devastation. The Phantom team was successfully extracted from the smoldering operational zone by waiting helicopters at exactly 03:45, having remarkably spoken fewer than 50 words during their entire 6-day deployment into the deepest pits of hell. This monumental, jaw-dropping victory was not merely a localized tactical win, but a devastating psychological blow that fundamentally altered the behavior of the entire opposing military machine for years to come. The conventional desk-bound generals lounging comfortably in Washington continually measured their fragile military success by constantly counting the sheer number of fallen adversaries and drawing meaningless, colorful lines on large topographical maps. However, the brilliant unorthodox pioneers of the long-range patrol program measured their unparalleled success by the priceless quality of actionable intelligence gathered and the sheer amount of massive enemy forces neutralized by just a handful of hidden, silent men. The opposing army was absolutely terrified of these silent phantoms, visibly altering their entire logistical behavior and drastically spreading out their supply columns out of pure, unadulterated fear of sudden, inescapable aerial retribution. We now know from heavily classified, captured military documents that the highest-ranking enemy commanders desperately warned their junior troops about terrifying American demons who mysteriously disappear into the forest and always return with ungodly fire. The actual verified names of the 6 heroic men who masterfully orchestrated this phenomenal tragedy in the autumn of 1968 have been permanently scrubbed from the accessible public archives by strict, overly cautious government censors. The rigid culture of total discretion that made these elite operators so incredibly effective also absolutely guaranteed that they would never publicly boast to the media about how they single-handedly dismantled the enemy war machine from the inside out. But their unparalleled patience, perfectly combined with their unmatched tactical discipline, proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that pure, unadulterated silence is truly the most destructive weapon ever unleashed on a modern battlefield. They simply dissolved into the dense, black jungle like untouchable ghosts, waited patiently for the absolute perfect mathematical second, and then quietly called down an apocalyptic fire that forever changed the brutal course of military history.